Yo, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast that digs into the world of comic books. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is a great one. Comics newcomer and writer Mat Groom joins the show to discuss his path to comics, storytelling, and his upcoming Image Comics series, Self-Made. But before we get into this week's chat, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And hey, make sure to rate and review Off Panel as well. It helps the show in the magical world of algorithms and the internets. And if you're a super fan of the show, you can back it on Patreon as well at patreon.com/offpanel. In exchange for your support, you'll get early access to each week's show, exclusive access to written and audio content, and more. And now, let's get to this week's episode. Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel. This week's guest is a newcomer both to the world of comics and the show, as well as the writer of the upcoming Self-Made at Image Comics. It's Mat Groom. Thanks for coming on, Matt.
Thank you very much for having me, David. I'm really excited to be here.
So the reason why I want to have you on has nothing to do with your comic. I just want to talk about video games. We both played Spider-Man PS4. Are you playing The Heist? That's what I want to know.
I have just finished The Heist. I was really torn. I was trying to hold myself off and try and get all of the DLC in one go and just play it through straight, but I couldn't help it. I needed to get back into that Spider-Man. I was craving it too much.
Yeah, I was what my current plan is to wait for all three of because it's like not a complete story, right? It's part one of like a 3-part story that's going to be told over the DLC, right?
Yeah, but I would say that it certainly has its own narrative arc to it. It does end on a to be continued, and it's obvious that you'll get more of the story. But I feel like there is something of a complete mini story told within each DLC pack.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, I'm very interested in it. I did love the Spider-Man game. I want to get into it, but I'm just like, do I wait until the end? I kind of do that when it's like episodic stuff. Like I really love the Telltale games. Well, I loved the Telltale games, I guess. And those ones were very episodic. So I would just wait till that's all out and then go through it all. But, video games are kind of a weird place to start. It's going to make a little bit more sense as we go along. But I do want to talk about your background because as you noted in your initial emails, I don't normally have guests who are pretty new to comics. Most people aren't going to necessarily know who you are. So like, what's your background? Like when you were younger, like what first got you interested in stories? Was it video games? Was it comics? What was it?
Yeah, I mean, a bit of everything, really. I have been interested in telling stories, particularly since I was quite young. I remember in primary school, I guess it's elementary school in America, I had this habit of writing out these short stories that sort of incorporated people in the class and then passing them around for everybody to read. So it's always been something that's brought me joy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just something that I've been able to make my day job over the past sort of few years and now really get into in comics, which is incredibly exciting.
Wow, you were fearless when you were young. I mean, whenever I would do anything that involves stories or art or anything like that, it would be very difficult for me to release it into the world. I remember distinctly when I was young, like my family would ask me to see my drawings and I'd be like, no, they are terrible. You cannot see it. Or if like anything I wrote, I'd be like, no, unless it's for school, no one else can read it. It is entirely personal. You were actually handing out copies of your stories. You were a little badass.
Oh, yeah. I think I used up all of my bravery then because it scares the shit out of me now. I would love to have that confidence right now, but
yeah.
It's not there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Self-Made #1 comes out, was it December 5th?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Yeah. So you're entering like the 1-month window before it's released. That is going to be a very interesting. Is this your first this is your first widely released comic, right?
I co-wrote an 8-page story for a Boom Studios Power Rangers annual.
Okay.
But for all intents and purposes, this is my first comic. So yeah, I'm gonna be freaking out over the next 4 weeks. Absolute meltdown.
So as far as comics go, like at what point did you first start getting into comics? Like because you're from Australia, and that, as a person who has visited Australia, I know that there's some, I don't know if roadblocks is the right way to put it, but it is more expensive there than it is in the United States to read Marvel and DC comics, for example, because they have to ship them there. At what point did you first start getting into the medium as just a fan and as a reader?
I have been reading comics intermittently since I was very young. We used to. This is going to be a very Australian reference. There's a carnival, I guess you could say, that we have every year in Sydney, which is our biggest city, called the Sydney Easter Show, and it's like an agricultural fair, but it also has like carnival elements to it.
Sure.
And one of the big appeals of it is that they'd give away, or you could actually buy in a lot of cases, things called show bags, which are just plastic bags filled with shit from random people.
Hmm.
And I used to get a really cheap one that had Phantom comics in it. So
Like
I've
the
been reading
Phantom?
the Phantom,
Okay,
yeah,
yeah.
as in like Slam Evil, Billy Zane, the
Hmm.
Phantom. Uh, and that was the only comic that was reliably available in Australian newsagents as well.
Hmm.
We'd get the odd Spider-Man one from time to time, but you couldn't count on it. So I had a lot of that. But I think it was obviously I is right in the target demographic for Batman the Animated Series when that hit,
Oh yeah.
and that kind of blew me away. And I saw particularly the Mask of the Phantasm, the movie, which like really rocked my world. So after that, I had to sort of seek out more Batman stuff. So I managed to find a comic book store in the next town over, essentially, and it was more a comic section in a record store, but they had a much bigger range than I'd ever seen in my life. So I started digging into that, and it was a Grant Morrison Justice League trade was the first thing that I picked up. So I was diving headfirst into, I think it was like Zoriel, and Plastic Man was on the team, and Huntress was on the team, and I had no idea what was going on, but I was into it.
Was that okay? The funny thing is that was it wasn't one of the first comics for me, but I remember that just being kind of a game changer for me. Was that the first arc that Zoriel was on it? Like the first one when he appears, where it's like they're actually battling with heaven and everything like that.
No, no, see that would have been helpful context.
You're just like, who is this angel guy?
Oh yeah, this trade opened with the Shaggy Man, I think,
Okay, yeah.
and it you get I think it's actually a Mark Millar one shot story in the middle, and then maybe there's a Mark Wade back half.
Okay.
So it's like it's all great content, but it's a real dog's breakfast if you're a newcomer. I'll tell you that much.
It's a really fascinating run for a number of reasons, but one of the things that I think is most interesting about it is like it was almost like Grant Morrison and everybody else that worked on the book had challenged themselves to tell a Justice League story without using any of the typical Justice League type stories or characters. It's like you had
Yeah.
the core group of characters, but like, oh, we're gonna fight Heaven, or we're gonna fight White Martians, or we're gonna invent characters like Prometheus, and you're just like, what the hell is happening here? Where's like, I don't know, Starro or like Lex Luthor or something like that? He's just like, whatever, I'm doing what I want. I'm Grant Morrison. I'm crazy. That's awesome. I wanted to talk about regionality because I was having a conversation with my wife this morning over breakfast, and we were talking about some of these like ideas that are like very regional in the United States, where we call one thing a different thing depending on where you're at. And I think comics are a really interesting regional thing because if you grew up in the UK, you might have grown up reading like, I don't know, Phoenix or something like that, or you might have grown up
Yeah.
reading Asterix, or if you grew up in Belgium, you were definitely reading like Tintin. Or if you grew up in Japan, obviously it's gonna be a hugely different thing. And you were growing up, and I never would have. Well, I don't know why the Phantom was big in Australia, but that's really fascinating to me. I would love to see like a map of comic readers and what the most common first comic is. But
Uh
like the
huh.
idea that the Phantom was this like newsstand staple in Australia is just kind of blowing my mind right now.
Well, I can't tell you why it happened, but Australia somehow, or rather, a company in Australia somehow got the license to reprint old Phantom comics and produce new Phantom content in a format that's exclusively to Australia. So
Ooh,
we've had Phantom comics consistently for the past, I think, like 40 years.
wow.
When my understanding is in America, it hasn't been in a comic book format, like except for like a few miniseries, basically at all.
Hmm. I love to think that apparently I'd love to like know what the box office numbers were for the Billy Zane movie in Australia. Like, was it like atypically popular there or something? That would be really interesting. But
I was a bit too young to sort of speak for the Australian society in general, but I can tell you that My jam for sure.
That's awesome. Wait, so where did you grow up? I'm just curious, having visited there. Like, was that comic shop in a bigger city that you first started going
Yeah.
to?
So I grew up in a town called Queanbeyan, which is just outside Canberra, which is our capital city.
Hmm.
But it's the capital city in the way that Washington is the capital city of America. It's certainly not our New York or LA. It's comparatively small.
Right. Okay. Cool.
Uh, and then I sort of moved to Sydney in the years since.
Yeah, I actually visited a fair amount of comic shops when I visited back in 2011. I actually went to the shop that you're doing a signing for for Self Made in December, King's Comics. I
They're great.
Random fact for you: I read Fear Itself #1 there, the Marvel event comic.
Ah,
Yeah, I remember I was just like, oh, I'm gonna go check this out. And I'm like, oh, Fear Itself #1 came out, and I read it, and I was like, what the hell is this comic? This is weird. Um, Anyways, well, at what point did you realize that you wanted to start telling stories, particularly stories in comics?
well, I've always had an interest in stories, and my day job started as essentially a copywriter. But my job was to help brands create the voice of their brand. And that came with a lot of like figuring out the messaging for them and things like that. And just in my off time, I spent a lot of time sort of researching stories and trying to learn about them. And I looked at like, at the standard places like Robert McKee and even like up to Dan Harmon these days speaks about story quite a bit. And I found that it was a really useful framework to use when thinking about communicating with people. So I'm going to call it my gimmick for my work was using story. And it got to the point where I was teaching story classes for our business clients, and then also just doing like open to the public storytelling classes. So I had all of that sort of in my head, and then I ended up interviewing Kyle Higgins for a podcast that I do, and we ended up making that a regular thing. And then Kyle and I started talking all the time, almost exclusively about story and breaking down stories we loved, and I'd sort of help him flesh out his ideas from time to time. And at some point, he was like, "Would you like to write a comic book?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely. I would love to write a comic book." So just as like he asked me to write a 22-page script as like a test, basically, to see how well I would do. And what I wrote was, but with a few minor differences, was the first issue of Self Made. And he dug it and said, "Hey, I really like this. Can I edit the book and we'll walk it around to some publishers to see if they dig it, and I'll help you find an artist." And yeah, here we are.
That is an extremely wild origin story. It basically started. Okay, so it started with your podcast, which is Ranger Danger, right?
That's it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. I just want to talk about that really quick. Ranger Danger.
Uh-huh.
You and your buddy, who is actually the designer on this book, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys are doing a podcast where you're trying to watch and talk about every episode of Power Rangers ever. Is that what it is, basically?
That is exactly right. We've been going for 5 years. We have 400 hours of content in, and I'm going to say about a quarter of the way through that journey.
My God, and you're also taking jaunts where you're interviewing people and talking about other things. That is one heck of a podcast aim. But I do think it's interesting because I was going to talk to you about the idea of breaking in, because the idea of breaking in is obviously one that people talk about a lot, because there's always the theory that everybody who reads comics secretly wants to make comics. And especially people who actively talk about them, like, myself, someone who has a podcast, like most people would probably think that I want to make comics. I do not want to make comics. But it is interesting because you didn't even really try to break in. You just kind of it was almost like you were challenged to break in, and you succeeded in doing so.
Yeah, I think when people say they want to write comics, I suspect a lot of the time it's more they want to be involved in the world. They want to play with the characters that they're familiar with.
Right.
But I think the people who will succeed in making comics, or at least succeed in getting a shot to make comics, are people who have a fascination with storytelling more fundamentally. And although comics is the medium that they love best, or are able to express themselves best in, if comics didn't exist, they'd probably end up writing novels or stage plays or radio plays or something.
Right. Yeah, I do think that a lot of people complain about the idea that there's novelists or people who work on TV shows or movies or whatever that come in to write comics, and it's just like, I think they're almost viewed as like tourists. It's like there are people who are just coming to like take advantage of the fact that comic book movies are a big thing and maybe they can make money off of that. But I do think that there's something to be said about people who are just passionate about stories wanting to try a different medium that might speak to them. Because you look at, like, I don't know if you read Rainbow Roll and Chris Anka's Runaways, but she...
Oh, I haven't yet.
Oh, it's fantastic. And she's somebody who hadn't really written comics before then, and she just took to it. She was a YA novelist, and she is an exceptional writer just from the jump. Not everyone's like that, but I do think that there is a bit of a stigma to that. But I think you're totally on the right track there, in the sense that if you want to succeed in comics, you shouldn't necessarily only be about comics. It's like you almost should you should be a passionate storyteller. It shouldn't just be necessarily comics or everything for you.
Absolutely. And I think if you're someone who's interested in story, comics are a particularly attractive medium because, and this actually didn't occur to me until quite recently about why specifically I like it as a medium outside of the genre trappings. Story is really just about beat to beat to beat. Like, what are the essential parts that you need to communicate? And comics distills that so perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Every panel is exactly what it needs to be, and then you don't cover anything at all that you don't need to. And I think it's distinct even from film, where it would be too much of a chaotic, jarring experience if you did that in film to the same extent. Like, you show people walking up to the car, they open the door, they get into the car, they turn the thing. In this, if turning on the car is the beat that you need to hit, you just show a single frame of that key in the ignition. So there's something very pure in terms of storytelling, and it's almost like the really fundamental energy of it that goes into comics.
Yeah, it rewards being economical with how you're telling a story. It's if you have something that's stretched out too far. This isn't a statement about decompressed storytelling, which has long been a popular thing in comics, but I mean, if you stretch something out too far, readers are going to feel it. And if you make it too quick, readers aren't going to understand it. It's like there's this middle area that you need to live in, and it's quite the challenge. I mean, this is a terrible comparison, but for a long time, I really liked Twitter, particularly because they kept things to 140 character limit. And it really challenged me to try to get points across in a very brief manner, which is something that I do not excel at. So I think that I like the idea that comics are both something that's only limited by your imagination, but you're restricting yourself to finding the right way to tell this story.
Oh yeah, it's profoundly restrictive in a really exciting way, I think. Particularly in the sort of the direct market format where you're doing 22 page issues. If you want to tell a complete story in that space, you have to be profoundly economical.
Oh yeah.
And you've also got to remember to give a lot of meat to your artists. Like, some things just they demand big moments, and that's going to take up a whole page of real estate, which is, a second in a TV show or a film. So it's a real challenge, but I think it's something that I would, any sort of writer, I would recommend giving a go to writing comics, because even just as an exercise, I think it's going to really sharpen some muscles.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying it's, sharpen muscles, it's going to build some muscles there.
Yeah. Well, sharpening muscles, I don't think I want to go through that. That sounds terrible, to be honest. Did you have any cursory interest in writing comics before Kyle challenged you, or was that just something?
Oh yeah, actually. Yeah, I probably about 10 years ago, I went to a workshop being run by Colleen Doran when she was in Sydney.
Nice.
And she was great. But they had a competition to sort of like create a comic and submit it, and the best one would get sort of one-on-one time with her. So I did that with a friend of mine and entered, and we didn't get that. And at that point, I just had this sinking feeling of, if I can't make it in this room of 10 people, I'm not able to break into the comics industry from Sydney. That's impossible.
Right.
But what a lot of it too was I just wasn't ready yet. I hadn't learned a lot, and obviously I still have so much to learn. But I was a pretty primitive storyteller back then.
Yeah. Well, it is. It seems like a lot of like you said earlier, like your day job, a lot of it is storytelling, and I did want to actually talk about that because I feel like your line of work definitely works on cultivating that economy that you're talking about, but also just your ability to like envision different ways to approach story, because you work for the People, which is a design strategy agency focused on getting businesses closer to people through design, storytelling, and technology, according to their Twitter. So are you just a copywriter, or are you like, what is your role there, and how do you find that job affects you as a storyteller in your approach?
Well, we're a pretty small agency, and we've sort of built it around the idea that if you get a bunch of relatively smart people that work well together, they're going to be able to solve most problems. And we obviously we all have specialties. Like I'm pretty good with words. We have world-class designers, but we all work together to solve the problems that we're given.
Right.
So as much as there is a writing component to it, to my job, there's also a messaging, which is sort of like figuring out what these brands should be saying, what they
Right.
should be communicating. And then there's also a level above that, I guess, which is strategy, which is where is this brand going? What spaces should they be moving into? What's their relationship with people? And I think that really relies on empathy, but that all communication does. I think all communication is about empathy, and all storytelling is about empathy. So I think that's kind of the core fundamental muscle I've had to build in that role. And I think it's the core fundamental muscle of any sort of storyteller, is being able to extend yourself beyond what you think and figure out what people are looking for and what their expectations are, and then figure out how you can either meet them or subvert them, or also direct them towards your goal in a more mercenary sense.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, you're putting in reps in something else that people wouldn't necessarily think that working in advertising in any capacity would translate to comics. But like you're saying, that is like a fundamental necessity for being a writer, is understanding what people are looking for and how to best get that story or that messaging across. I don't know. As a person I also work in an advertising agency, and so it's really fascinating to see that as part of your resume, and it makes a lot of sense. Also, you guys do really nice stuff. Good job.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
So how do you balance that with the writing gig and like the Ranger danger? Like, is it? I find that part to be really fascinating, because I have a day job, I have my podcast and everything like that, but it's like you have all these layers. Are you just like constantly spinning plates, or what's going on?
Oh yeah, I'm falling apart at the seams. It's real bad. It's my life is a disaster. Yeah, look, I've gone to what is technically part-time, which is 4 days a week at my job.
Okay.
So I have a day to spend on comics, and then I try and fit all the podcasting stuff in on the weekends.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's difficult. I guess at this point, I'm overextending myself in the hopes that in the future I will have some time to chill out. But right now it's all systems go. And as you can imagine, I'm like, trying to prepare some pitches for other projects and things like that. So and also working at Image, I love it, but it's also slightly more work than your typical work for hire comics gig, because we're making a lot of the creative decisions and the production decisions ourselves, and we're managing our own schedules. So yeah, it's a lot. It's a whole lot.
I really enjoyed your tweet where you said it turns out making comics is 85% spreadsheets. Which,
oh yeah,
yeah, I mean, that actually makes a lot of sense. I think that's the thing that people don't understand about writing or making a book at Image, is that if you think that just making comics is going to be the tough part, you do not know what exactly it's going to entail, because it's production, it's managing schedules. I mean, if you don't have like a full-time editor, and I don't exactly know what Kyle's role is, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. Yeah. And then obviously, you're doing marketing right now. You're talking to somebody, but you also have to talk to other people. You have to maybe reach out to retailers. You have to do all kinds of stuff, and it's just it's a full-time job on top of the job of making comics. But it's pretty wild. But last thing I want to ask about before we get into self-made is how Australia. I mean, as somebody who's from Alaska, I know that being far from the center of the comics conversation can be difficult, because, I mean, first off, time zones, pain in the ass. Second off, I mean, you have two additional wrinkles. Obviously, you're really far away, but the fact is that comics are like prohibitively expensive in Australia. Like, how do those things impact you as both as a reader and as someone trying to get into comics?
It's been it's been helpful in a way, the how expensive everything is, because I had for the past couple of years been reading things in trade just to try and save money and be able to afford bread.
Right.
But in the lead up to, basically, as soon as we got the green light on self-made, I went to my local comic store, which is King's Comics in Sydney, and set up a pull list and started reading a whole bunch of floppies regularly, because I figured I needed to know what readers were expecting and what they were getting. And it certainly puts a fine point on my need as a reader to get a complete story in an issue when I'm paying just crazy amounts for it. So yeah, I guess I'd say it's helped me make sure that I'm trying to give every issue as much as I can, but also make it feel sort of holistic and like I wouldn't be disappointed if I spent $8 on it,
right,
at the local comic book store.
Yeah, so how much, just for listeners that don't know, how much is like a single issue, like let's say like a Marvel single issue or an Image?
It actually fluctuates a little bit, but off the top of my head, I think it's sort of between $6.50 and $8 Australian, which, yeah, it's a bit more than the US cover price when sort of converted.
Yeah.
Which I think that's because they have to ship it
right
literally all across the world. Yeah.
This is why we can never complain again, because it's like, oh no, we have to spend $3.99 American. I'm like, oh, you're not in Australia, man. That is really expensive. But yeah, I when I was in the shops, I have to admit, I was like walking around and I was like, it is like King's Comics is legitimately a very good shop. But it was, I was just thinking, I was just like, I don't know if I could be a comic reader if I lived in Australia. But at the same time, obviously there's different, like, you know, cost of living is different. There's how much you earn is different, everything like that. But I do like the idea that also forces you to be economical and forcing you to really pay attention to what you like and kind of hone everything. It seems like a lot of what you've done has had to hone into a very specific vision of how you approach and how you look at comics, which is actually really convenient as a storyteller.
Yeah, it all worked out in the end. But I think like that's only one part of that pressure. Like I certainly feel as my first comic essentially, and as Eduardo's first step into the US mainstream, really, it's so important to me that this first issue have as much as I can possibly offer to everybody who picks it up. Like I love decompressed storytelling. It certainly lends itself very well to trade, but as a new talent coming out at a independent publisher, I don't have the trust with the audience to be like, oh, this is a small part of the first chapter. Don't worry, it's really going somewhere. I had to make sure that it's hitting from the first issue.
Yeah, you're not Brian Michael Bendis writing action comics. You have to like just get in there.
Exactly.
You can't have 5 page or like a page dedicated to Adam Strange just hanging out in space by himself. Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick break to talk about my friends at Radio vs. the Martians. Mike Gillis and Casey Doran host the Radio vs. the Martians podcast, a show that gathers their funniest, smartest friends once a month for a deep dive into science fiction, video games, horror, comics, movies, and everything in between. So far, they've dissected topics like Superman, Steven Spielberg, Akira, George Lucas, zombies, Twin Peaks, Hayao Miyazaki, James Bond, Watchmen, and whether drivers are required to pull over for the Ghostbusters. Find this podcast and its spin-off show, Podcast La Vista, baby, a celebration of the films of thespian and statesman Arnold Schwarzenegger on iTunes, Stitcher, and RadioVersusTheMartians.com. And now, back to the show. All right, so I'm gonna do something that's truly evil to do. I'm going to first walk through the solicit, and then I'm going to live review your comic. Are you ready for this?
Oh God, no, definitely not. But let's do it.
Okay, so we're gonna talk about Self-Made, which is Matt's new comic, upcoming comic from Image Comics. Here's the solicit from number 1. Introducing a new creative team everyone will be talking about: superstar talent writer Mat Groom and artist Eduardo Ferigato. When chaos besieges the kingdom of Arcadia, Warrior Amala Sitlali sees it as her chance to escape her clearly defined role and to change her destiny. But she could never have predicted that it would also be her chance to confront her god. In his debut editorial role, comics veteran Kyle Higgins guides this intimate, world-spanning story of self-discovery. I have to admit, when I read the solicit, I wasn't totally sure about it just because the whole I don't know, the chance to confront God thing. I was like, I love like his Dark Materials, the Philip Pullman book series, and like that is literally about confronting God. Preacher is my favorite comic. That is also about confronting God. So apparently that is a theme for me. But Matt, that is, I've read the first 4 issues. It is one of my favorite Image debuts of the year. I really, really, genuinely love it. And here's the thing that blows me away, and it makes sense given everything you've said. I read the first 4 issues. And maybe the most impressive thing about it is how effectively it feels like 4 different comics in 4 issues while all sticking to its core identity. Like everything bridges perfectly while all like the status quo is flipped so much, but it all works really well. And it reminds me a lot of, there's this comic that only ever had 2 issues released from Image called Non-Player. It's by Nate Simpson. I don't know if you've ever read it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was very frustrated because I wanted to call my comic non-player, but I got pipped to it. Just I'm not bitter at all. But no, God, isn't that a gorgeous comic?
Oh, it's so good. I love it. It's funny. It's like most people are mad about that comic all the time because only 2 issues have been released in 7 years. But I'm just like, the 2 issues are so good. I just don't really care. But yeah. Anyways, but I do want to say that 2 things that really stand out about it, besides everything I've already said, is first off, you have a hell of an art team. Eduardo Ferigato, never seen his stuff before. He's incredible. And Marcelo Costa is like a perfect match for him on colors. And then the other thing, your buddy is a hell of a designer, because the design is the stuff that really first got me. Like the cover transitioning into like the kind of, I don't know, transitional pages where it says self-made. That sets the stage so well, and it like flows in perfectly to this very cinematic first page. It just it has a very nice feel, and it's such a good gateway into the story. And I don't know, I mean, I really appreciate how much it feels like there's a lot of thought that goes into transitioning it into this unique feeling world that isn't necessarily exactly what you think it's going to be. And anyways, that's my review. Good job.
Well, that means an incredible amount to me. Thank you, David. I really appreciate that. That's so good to hear. I guess I've been existing in a vacuum, so I have no idea what anybody's going to think of it. That's really relieving. Yeah, you mentioned Eduardo, and we had a few different. We're looking at a few different people for artists, Kyle and I. But as soon as we saw Eduardo's stuff, I knew straight away it was a real love at first sight situation. And we've been talking on Skype, and like he really is a massive part of the process now. Like that, the first issue was self-made. I scripted myself with a little bit of input from Kyle, but from there on out, he's been a major part of the process. And I think because we're such similar people and we get along so well, I feel like we've got a really strong collaboration going on. So I feel on it, like, not to get too sappy, but really blessed to have Eduardo on my side, and I think he's going to make some waves. And Marcelo, the colorist, is actually a guy who Eduardo knows from the comic scene in Brazil, and he's an illustrator in his own right and quite a good one. But Eduardo was, because he also colors his own work, and Eduardo was always really jealous of, or he really appreciated Marcelo's colors and said, one day you're going to color my work. So when someone he's like, all right, this is it. Let's go. It's go time. And yeah, they're a really great team.
I think that, that seems to happen sometimes. Like, do you know who Javier Rodriguez is? He's a phenomenal artist, one of my absolute favorite artists. But he actually started Marvel primarily doing color work for some of the other Spanish artists, and then all of a sudden, like, he was working on Daredevil with with everybody that was on that book, and he did a few issues in there, and I was just like, how this guy that was coloring the book is now my favorite artist on a series that had Marcos Martin and Paulo Rivera and Chris Somney. And I'm like, apologies to you guys. You guys are amazing. But at the same time, I was like, Javier Rodriguez, that guy is amazing. But I have to ask, I read this in an interview. Why was it originally called Heir Presumptive?
Well,
is that a spoiler?
The honest answer, no. It's just that I did not have a great name for it. and still did not have a great name for it when I called it Hair Presumptive. But it was meant to evoke this idea that some people in life, it seems like it's ordained that they're going to rise to a position of prominence or importance and purpose. And for others, that they aren't necessarily in that position. So, yeah, it was that. But I didn't love it. So I was very happy that we got to Self-Made eventually.
I do like Self-Made. Hair Presumptive, when I saw it, I was just like, that's a really interesting title. Like it feels like it's got layers. I'm fascinated by it. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting book, and I do think it's kind of funny that in the one interview you've done for this, you immediately got questions about Westworld, which is funny because I know you haven't actually watched that, and yeah. I don't get that at all personally, but that's maybe it's just that, I don't want to, I have to bring up something really quick. I know this is a quick transition, but your book is very interesting. It's a very interesting challenge to talk about it because it evolves so much. Oh
yeah, you're telling me.
Like I feel like I don't want to say anything about it because the second issue is basically a completely different world than the first issue, and by the fourth issue, it's like you're dealing with a completely different thing. Like I was trying to work an elevator pitch together, like to say it's like, oh, this is like Jaws meets Demolition Man or something like that. But your story is tough because to say what it's really, you do an elevator pitch, it's kind of a spoiler for the first issue in a way.
I had a conversation with an editor at one of the big two publishers and was basically asking for advice on marketing it. And he said, spoil it. Spoil the whole thing. You're a new creator. It's the high concept. Just put it out there. The issue one will be slightly less impactful, but you need to do it to be able to talk about the book and get the word out. And I was like, yes, you're absolutely right. You're far wiser than me. I could not agree more. I can't do it. I just can't bring myself to do it. I think it comes back to that, like how expensive comics are thing. It's about giving the reader as much meat in their experience as I can. And I definitely think it's going to kneecap us a little bit because I have been like tying my tongue into knots trying to market this thing without giving anything away. But I think readers deserve surprises. And I think it's disappointing that's not always the case in modern comics.
I think that is actually one of the things I really appreciated about it. It was because I read the solicit and it was one thing, and like I don't mean this in like a Batman number 50, we're pulling a fast one on you guys type of thing. But I mean like the solicit's one thing, but then you read it, it is that thing, but then it becomes something else. And it's really fascinating. I read it and I really appreciated that I didn't know what to expect. And I think that's one of the things that's a real benefit to you, as you guys are a new creative team and you have this idea that gets flipped really fast, and it makes it a very fulfilling reading because you don't know what to expect from any of it, and what the result is a good comic, and that's awesome.
Oh, thank you. I think just to give some credit where credit's due, you mentioned earlier how it feels like every issue is its own story and it moves from one world to the next quite rapidly. And that came about because I made just the biggest rookie mistake when I was outlining the series, which was to create an outline for a 30-issue series with 6 arcs. And so this was after Kyle had read Self-Made 1, which I'd written as a self-contained, like, oh, this is just like a test script. And then he's like, all right, pitch the series. So I created this outline. And I'd blown everything out, and that first issue became an arc, and then there was another 5 arcs. And Kyle said, what are you doing? Like, first of all, you can't take it for granted that you're going to get 30 issues. In fact, it's unlikely that you will. But also what I love so much about this first script was that it felt so rapid and impactful. So I sort of took that as my new, like, North Star. And what I did was I turned every arc of the book into an issue. So the first 6 issues of Self-Made are the first 6 arcs of the outline, which I think is hopefully why it feels quite speedy.
But I mean, it is speedy, but not in a way that takes away from the impact of any of the story. But that is really intense. 6 arcs, man, that is, I love it. Yeah, I think that there's something to be said about that because you have to have your own angle. You have to have your own approach. And it's like,
Mm.
do you know the story about how Robert Kirkman managed to make Walking Dead happen effectively?
Oh yeah, he lied to Image.
Yeah, he said it was going to involve aliens. And,
Yeah.
and and like and they're like, okay, yeah, do that. And they're like, where are the aliens? He was like, nah, I just told you guys that so you'd publish it. And like, I think that's amazing. I mean, not that you want to lie to people or anything like that, but the thing is sometimes you have to have your own angle. Like, if you just said that I'm going to make this story that's about people walking around and being sad because of zombies, people are going to be like, well, that sounds horrible. So
Yeah.
we're not going to publish this. But if you have like some sort of angle there, that works. I like the idea of like condensing so much story into it, because the story zigs when we've talked about decompressed storytelling. You're zigging while everyone else is zagging, and it really, you feel it. It's like I always feel weird about saying that comics have a lot of value story wise. It's like it takes a while to read, it has a lot of story to it, but it's true. I mean, each issue has a ton of punch to it, and like that helps a lot. So what the whole God or the creation meeting its creator thing seems like a very pervasive theme throughout the whole story, but
Yeah.
where does that come from for you? Like, what inspirations did you have that made you want to tell this story?
It's tough to pin down because a lot of these ideas in terms of theme and setting and plot execution all kind of bubble to the surface simultaneously. But I think the heart of it is, I like to say, when you're looking for a great story engine, you want to find a contradiction, something that it's true both ways, and there's really no way around it, and the friction between those two truths really pushes it forward. And for me, the friction here is from everybody has this internal desire to have a place in the world and to feel like they matter and that they've got a role. But also, if you did find out that you had a role to play and there was a God who was dictating your life path, that would be very constricting. And I feel like you'd feel like you're kind of reduced in that you're just a cog in the machine.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like those two twin desires that we have that can't be resolved is a really universal thing. And self-made is just a very specific and weird vehicle for exploring that. And I think the creator creation way is a really a personally evocative way for me to get into those ideas, because as a storyteller, you are creating things to put out into the world. And I surround myself with creatives and artists and people who are constantly trying to express themselves through what they make, and their relationship with what they make is kind of endlessly fascinating to me. So I think that's the heart of the inspiration.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense that you started with Grant Morrison, given the fact that he is the guy who put himself into his own comic to meet his creation. I don't know if you ever read his
Yeah.
Animal Man stuff, but
Yeah, no, I love Grant, and I wonder how much that weird Justice League story, not that I'd ever describe it as like a typical Grant Morrison story, but particularly that one, but I feel like that just kind of set the tone for my comic interest moving forward.
Yeah, that would be an interesting thing. Like, find out what people's first real formative comic was, and see how it like kind of impacted them. I had a much different experience. I think the first thing I read were like Transformers comics, so I'm apparently perpetually searching for robots in disguise and not finding them. But no, Grant, it is funny though, because that was an odd comic for Grant Morrison, because I really feel like the old JLA stuff was really him trying to be the straightforward superhero writer version of Grant Morrison, but it was still like,
Yes.
he was still weird. And I thought that was a really fascinating place to start. And like, I don't think self-made is like, not that you're trying to be weird or you're trying to have Animal Man meet his creation or anything like that with self-made, but it is interesting because it does have a straightforward appeal even beyond like the creator meeting creation stuff. It's got layers, which I appreciate. I do have to ask, like, what do you have an elevator pitch that you use, or is that just too spoilery?
No, I have basically what's in the solicit, which I just want to take a moment to say I did write the solicit. I didn't use the word superstar. That was added by Image. But yeah, my pitch is basically the solicit. But what I do like to say is that to me, the elevator pitch that isn't necessarily immediately obvious, or what I'll say is that the two stories that I look to most for reference was the Michael Mann film Collateral and Toy Story. Because
whoa, what?
Yeah. Because what those two films to me do incredibly well is it takes two people who are hyper focused on their purpose in life and throws them at each other and shows how those two people meeting radically changes their perception of themselves and their place in the universe, essentially. And also they're just great sort of two-handers, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was trying to do with Self-Made. So yeah, Toy Story and Collateral.
That actually works really well. It's not something that would like stand out on surface, because obviously my reaction was like, what? But that makes a lot of sense once you explained it. You know, related to that, do you consider, you know, so I mentioned Amala's the only person who's mentioned in the first solicit. Obviously, there are other characters in the book, but would you consider Amala the lead character, or do you think it's more complicated than that?
I would say she's the lead protagonist, but we definitely have two protagonists in the series. To my mind, it really is a dual protagonist series, and the God that's referenced in the solicit copy is much less of an abstract force from sort of issue 2 onwards, and becomes absolutely the sort of co-lead of the book. So to me, it's about those two characters. And then we have some minor supporting characters and obviously an antagonist or two, but it's really just about those two.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm wondering which one's Tom Cruise and which one's Jamie Foxx. But I feel like that would be a spoiler unto itself.
For sure, yeah.
So I have to ask about your buddy doing the design in the book. Like, how did that come together? Because I'm a big fan of, I don't know, one of the things that I like to do is like, I like my wife to look at comics because she's a architect and a designer unto herself. And it's interesting to see what she thinks about covers, because covers are so essential to comics, and like the interior design and everything. And like the things that stand out to her, she loves Jonathan Hickman's covers. Like I was doing this garage sale and she happened to see some. She's like, what are these? Like she was immediately drawn to them. And Self-Made is a combination of, has very nice design, but also has traditional covers to it. So like, I guess my question is like, did you approach this with knowing that you wanted like the design elements to be a very core part of the book, because it feels very thoughtfully integrated into the comic?
Yeah, I'm relatively obsessive about the narrative experience, particularly in terms of immersion. And to me, the story starts from the tone that the cover sets and the interior design sets. And because I do the podcast with Michael and have been friends with him for years, he's particularly patient with my obsessive nature and my ridiculous feelings about immersion. So he was very generous to come onto the project and sort of help us figure all of that out. Because he's a visual designer and a web designer. He actually did our website as well by day. So he was able to bring a whole lot to the project in that regard. And for the logo for the series, I actually approached an old colleague of mine, Olivia King, who's one of Australia's best designers, but she's never worked in comics before either. But I knew that she would get it straight away. And I think sometimes bringing in outside people can help shake up sort of the presumed way of doing things and do things in a slightly different way. But I think all of this, it all works as a whole, because particularly the Image way of working means everyone just kind of has to get together in a conversation and be like, right, how are we going to make this happen? We've got a deadline, and obviously Kyle has some experience. He's been able to guide us in that sense. But other than that, we've really just had to hope for the best and charge ahead. And that means we've had to rely on each other and collaborate a lot. And I think that's why if it feels cohesive at all, that's why.
Yeah, no, I think one of the cool things about what everybody did in design is that it it kind of funnels you to the story, and it kind of establishes momentum to the first issue, where it's like you're being pushed downwards, and even the first page works into that. And I kind of feel like a lot of the page layouts that Eduardo uses does that. I
Yeah.
don't know. It's really fascinating. Speaking of that though, did you? This is your first real comic. I mean, it's your first big time comic. Like how tight were you on scripts, or were you pretty loose in letting Eduardo do what he wants for the layouts, or did you have really rigid ideas on how you wanted the art to work?
My scripts are very detailed and specific, simply because like there is a slight language barrier in that Eduardo's from Sao Paulo in Brazil, but
Mm-hmm.
his English is almost as good as mine. So I like to sort of provide as much detail as I can, but also Eduardo very much knows that he has total freedom to redesign things as he likes, and he often does, particularly now later in the series when we've got quite a trusting creative relationship. He'll sometimes even like play with the order of the pages and things like that, and then once he's sort of done an outline of what he's thinking, I'll go back and rescript based on his new way of thinking.
Wow.
So there's a lot of flexibility to it, and I think a lot of that is because like I have a lot of experience in thinking about stories, but he has a lot of experience in just doing them. Like he's done a lot of independent comics in Brazil, so he has a lot of experience, and it's good to trust that. Uh, so I just thought of when we were at the end of issue 2, we announced the antagonistic force for issue 3. And Eduardo read that in the script. Is like, oh, I'm really excited. I can't wait to draw that antagonist. It's going to be great. So about a month later, I sent him the script for issue 3, and he replied back. He's so polite, but he went, oh, I love the script. It's good, but I was thinking maybe Amala should have a fight with the antagonist. And I was like, what do you mean? They have a very meaningful confrontation with words. And he said, yeah, but what if also they had a fight? And I was like, yeah, you're probably right, buddy. Let's try something like that. So we did that, and obviously it's much better.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it's good. It's good to listen to your collaborators, because sometimes you're an idiot.
I'm sure you had a very good, meaningful confrontation with words planned out there.
Oh yeah, and it's basically there. It's just also a fight happens at the same time.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, I mean, I think that, I don't know. I think one of the interesting things is sometimes people get so bogged down with trying to stay on schedule and trying to move forward and everything like that, that sometimes you lose track of the collaboration. And it sounds like you are far enough ahead where you're still being able to do that 6 issues in, which is fantastic.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I don't think I could do it any other way, particularly now that I know how well just the quality that Eduardo produces when he has the freedom to do things his way and visualize the world in his own way. It's really vital to the series. He is the co-creator of Self-Made, and that's not just a title. He is as much this book as I am.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So I do want to ask, like, it's a tough question, because you're in a marketplace that has a lot of comics in it right now. It's a very crowded market,
Yeah.
and you're coming into a project as both an unknown and somebody who is bringing a story that isn't the same, but has like a sci-fi fantasy feel from a publisher that has a lot of sci-fi fantasy books. How do you overcome that? Like, what are you doing to try to garner traction on this book when, you have all those things facing you?
Mostly panic at this stage. The day when the solicits came out, and I realized, outside of all other factors, all other publishers and all other days, on December 5 from Image Comics, there's also Die, which is that Kieran Gillen Dungeons and Dragons book that I could not possibly be more excited for.
Right.
And also another Mark Millar #1. It's like, what? That's a lot to be competing against, even just within the one publisher on the stand. So it's front of mind. I guess at a certain point, all you can do is tell the best story you can and give as much as you can in those pages. But we're hustling as best we can. We're trying to get out there for interviews. We paid ourselves for the trailer that we've used to promote the book on Twitter. We're obviously going to reach out to retailers. I'm getting out and doing signings, but we're all very aware that it's an incredibly crowded marketplace. And I fully understand that people probably already have too much on their pull list. Uh, and there's not much that can be done about that. And like the problem is too, like so much of it is great work. Um, and I know there's a lot of conversation around about how Image is publishing so many titles, but seeing how many great comics are also coming out of like Aftershock and Vault and even and Boom, all the other like seemingly smaller publishers are hitting so many like massive success stories.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it just goes to show that yeah, there probably are too many comics out there, but any one of them told by the right team with the right passion and the right idea could be a massive success.
Right.
And if it's on the stand, then at least one person believed, well, I mean, a whole team of people believed, but one editor at least believed that it was something that people deserved to see and read. So I just got to trust that that's true of our book as well.
Yeah, I mean, going back to it, look at The Walking Dead. I mean, The Walking Dead, when it came out, like it seemed far fetched, like that a book like that would succeed, to the point where the creator had to fib about what it was about to ensure that it would be published. And now it's basically an industry unto itself, and like that's an astonishing thing. And I don't know, I actually think, just my business brain kicks in. I actually think Die and whatever the Miller book is coming out in the same day as your book is a good thing, because like those are destination books. Those get people in the shop probably. And
For sure.
And,
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so there might be an area of impact there. But I also like one of my favorite things that's ever been written about comics was Warren Ellis did this series of columns for Comic Book Resources way back in the day called Come In Alone. And one of the things he wrote about was, he's like, how can we have more good comics? He's like, you just have to make more comics. And we've seen that come to reality, is there are so many comics these days, but there's also a lot more good comics than there used to be. And so there's a real give and take from having so many comics in the market. It's a good thing for readers. It just makes it a little tougher for creators and retailers to maybe make money off of each one of them.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but I have to, actually, I don't even have to. I constantly remember that it's a remarkable privilege, and I've gotten incredibly lucky. And to have this shot is a real once in a lifetime opportunity. So you're not going to hear me complaining too much about the market, to be honest.
I was hoping you're going to be doing some crazy radical advertising stuff to promote the book, because you work in the industry. But, I do like that you guys have a trailer. I think a trailer is a very good play in 2018 because, well, first off, all social networks love video, but it's just, I don't know, it's a good way to get interest.
Absolutely. And Kyle managed to put us together with Diane Pershing, who is the voice of Poison Ivy on Batman the Animated Series, to do the voice of the trailer. So having that weird, like, cyclic, like, my real interest in comics started with Batman the Animated Series, and then here we are. It's just, it was a awesome bookend to things.
That is really nice. All right, so I just have two more questions. I wanted to ask, we've talked about like the 85% of comics is spreadsheets, but I am kind of curious, like what the most surprising thing about making comics has been so far. Is there anything that's really floored you about the process and the experience?
What floored me, and it's interesting because it's knowledge that I had already, but the extent to which, once Image gave us the green light, their involvement in what constituted and what was between the covers was really just send us the files once you're done.
Yeah.
It's like, all right. And like, I knew that was the case, but it still kind of blew me away. Like they also, for example, they asked me to choose what date the comic comes out. And when they asked that, I was like, what, why? No one should be making that decision less than me. Like
you're like, how do you even decide that? You're just like, all right, yeah. I'm going to throw darts at a calendar and hope for the best. Whatever Wednesday it's the closest to. My
like super rudimentary thinking was, start of December, you're less likely to be away on holidays at that point. Fingers crossed, let's go. That's the extent of thinking in that one. But that's why it's been so great to have Kyle on the book. Now, Kyle is a profoundly busy guy. So his input has been more around sort of just like advice around storytelling and specifically comic structure and things like that. But whenever we've had crises of like, oh, Image just asked us if we want glossy or matte print, what do we do? Why does that matter? He's been a great resource to sort of to call him up and just panic at him until he solves our problems.
Yeah, that is great. I was actually going to ask about what his role entails, but it sounds like it's more less less literally editor and more kind of confidant slash sounding board. Would that be a fair statement?
100%, yeah. And I think that's been our relationship in general anyway. So it certainly doesn't feel like I've had a changed relationship with him. I think what has impressed me though about Kyle and our relationship is Kyle has very different, I think like taste in storytelling, just in terms of like genre and execution and tone. But he's been really great about not trying to impose that on me, trying to understand the story that I want to tell and helping me mechanically get there rather than being like, oh, I wouldn't do that, I'd do this, which has just been profoundly helpful.
Yeah, he's not sculpting you. He's just like aiding you in finding the voice that you want to go with.
For sure. Like I couldn't be another Kyle Higgins, even if I wanted to be. So he's helping me just be a better Matt, I guess.
That's great. I do have to say it also helps that he is a super nice guy. I've met him once at what was it, Emerald City Comic Con, and I was walking over to the Image booth to talk to somebody, and I went over to talk to her, and she was already talking to Kyle, and she's like, "Oh, have you met Kyle Higgins?" I'm like, "No," and so we talked for a little bit. Very nice guy.
He's very nice. I've discovered that Kyle seemingly knows all humans, which is very impressive. And I think it's because he's such a generous and social dude.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I went to San Diego this year. It was my first time in America, and that was a whole thing. But I was hanging out with Kyle the whole time, basically. And I think I was at the Boom booth just looking over some stuff, and Kyle tapped me on the shoulder. He's like, "Oh, hey, I just want to introduce you to my friend Kevin Eastman." I was like, "Sorry, what?" The tales were my life. I got to sort of quietly tell him about Self-Made, and he was like, "Oh yeah, rad. I used to do independent comics," and I was like, "Yeah, dude, I know.
Yeah,
you're Kevin Eastman."
It's slightly notable independent comic that Kevin Eastman did.
He did all right.
Yeah, I feel like there's like several like fulcrum personalities in the comic industry that there's just like 5 Kevin Bacons in comics and they know everybody somehow.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would not be surprised that Kyle is one of them. Anyways, well, last question I do want to ask, because you are a fellow podcaster. We talked about Ranger Danger. How did you decide that you wanted to do that? Because it's a lot. I mean, I've been hosting a podcast since 2015, and you know it's been a great time. But mine is just like, my stuff changes all the time. You were reviewing and watching every single Power Rangers episode ever, and then talking about it to the point where you have 400 hours of podcasts. That's a lot. Like, how did that come together?
Michael and I just chat all the time anyway, and we both grew up with Power Rangers, so our conversations often would just kind of wander over to, wasn't that show really weird? It was really weird, right? Do you remember that happening? Yeah, I think that actually happened. And I guess because at the time we didn't have all that much going on, we decided to make it a podcast. And we got addicted, I think, to the bizarreness of it. Because it's such a weird cultural artifact, because it's half of a Japanese show, and that footage is cut out, and then an American writing team write another half of an episode and film it with American actors to try and fit into that footage. And that works about as often as you think it would from describing that process.
All the time?
So every single time. It's just bananas. So we kind of got a little addicted to, I think, like just exposing ourselves to that craziness, and almost in a really self-loathing kind of way. It became a challenge to see how much of it we could endure, because like, obviously we don't get twisted, we love the franchise, and as children we adored it, but it is a real strange creation, and watching it multiple times a week I feel like it's more of a sport than an entertainment activity at this point.
That's a good way to approach it.
Yeah, and I feel like every week we get a little further. I feel more like I've achieved something not good but impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel good about that.
Yeah, no, I do think that because I grew up right in the time I was like kind of coming out of the age where I'd probably watch it when it was first starting to get popular, and I did watch it, and I feel like the thing that's really amazing about it is it's kind of like, I don't know. I was talking to my wife this morning about dive bars and how you shouldn't try to be a dive bar. If you try to be a dive bar, you're going to fail at it because like you just are or you aren't. It's not something you can try to be at. And I think part of the amazing thing about Power Rangers is it was entertaining in a genuine way, but it was also entertaining in a completely absurd way because you're like, this is garbage that I love and it's great. And I think that, like they made the new movie, which I never actually watched, but it seemed like it was trying too hard to just be good. And I feel like trying too hard to just be good is kind of fundamentally misunderstanding what people loved about Power Rangers.
Yeah, it's tough because I think there's a few different ways to approach it. And I think they certainly took it too seriously, and they lost a lot of the well, frankly, the craziness that all the Japanese elements brought to it.
Right.
I think actually, not to sound like I'm sucking up, but I think Kyle has done a great job on his book because his approach was write the show not as it was, but as I remember it.
Right.
So in your head, it has all the bombast and excitement, but also in your head, it's like actually a strong drama with compelling characters, despite all of the insanity that's spinning around it. And that, to me, that really works. But trying to ground it, that doesn't work because so much of the appeal is like, it honestly just like the bright colors and the wacky monsters and the giant robots. Power Rangers without that, I feel like it's missing some of its DNA, unfortunately.
Yeah. I don't know. I think there's something to be said about doing what Kyle did, which is where you approach it as if it's like, approach it from a memory standpoint, not like being beholden to everything in it. Like I really loved, did you see the adaptation of the book Annihilation that, God, oh my God, I forgot what his name. Oh my God. What is the name of the guy who did it? It's the guy who did Ex Machina. Anyways, I love Annihilation, which has Natalie Portman and Jennifer Jason Leigh in it and everything. And the book is way, way, way different. It was Alex Garland who did it. Anyways, and the fascinating thing is like when Alex Garland was interviewed about it, because people are just like, this is way different than the book. He was just like, nah, I read it one time when it was a galley and I decided that I wouldn't reread it again. And I'm just going to adapt it based off my memory of it. I'm like, that is a weird way to do an adaptation, but I love it because the movie turned out awesome. But I don't know. I think sometimes adaptations or like not even adaptations, whatever you would call what Kyle's doing with the comic is like, it's best if you approach it with respect, but you have to give it your own flair.
Absolutely. And a lot of it even just comes down to the medium. Like comics aren't films. And I think a lot of to sort of connect to something we were talking about a while ago, when TV and film writers come into comics and they approach comics like it's just film or TV, I think that's where you see the stumbles that kind of give them a bad name, because even just down to the types of stories you can tell, it's fundamentally different. Like if you wanted to create a new creator-owned series and you had as your model a TV show, you'd fall flat on your face out of the gate, because you can't tell a serialized story. Like, say if they tried to do Adventure Time as a comic without having Adventure Time already existing, it wouldn't get off the ground, because you can't just tell very simple serialized stories without a through line, but also you can't trust that you're going to get past 6 issues necessarily. You have to make a big impact with one story in that first arc. It's not a simply translatable thing, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, totally. They're very different mediums, and I think you're exactly right about why sometimes those writers struggle with it. It's just you have to approach each medium in its own unique way. And I just want to say one more time before we go, I think you did a hell of a job with the first 4 issues of Self-Made, and I'm looking forward to people reading them. Matt, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting Self-Made and everything else with me.
Thank you so much. As I said, I really have. It's been a pleasure to be here, but also thank you for everything you do. Like especially new creators, need a resource. So hearing from publishers, hearing from retailers, hearing from editors, and from writers and artists, obviously, has been helpful to everyone, but very helpful to me personally. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Mat Groom. You can find him on Twitter at Matthew Groom. That's Matthew with 1 T. And in his upcoming Image Comics series, Self-Made, which has its first issue arrive on December 5th. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support the show, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find the show on social media by liking the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, following it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Tara Ferguson, TJ Dali, Dave Slusher, Kieran Marcantonio, WMQ Comics, Akil, Greg Lockhart, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Kent Heidelman, Philip Sevi, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Paletto, Dylan Campbell, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Nassy, Mike Gillis, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Dan Guarino, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Henning Allers, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, Darren Neely, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Phil Nall, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Carl McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Avino, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Highfield, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track outro from the album Volmilch opens and closes the show. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.